anyone working with psychedelics, there's an increasingly complex and challenging landscape to navigate. This week's episode is with returning guest Paul F. Austin. Paul is a prominent figure in psychedelics and has guided millions to safe and meaningful psychedelic experiences through his work as the founder of Third Wave. In this show, we explore the complex landscape of psychedelics, discussing personal journeys, the challenges of censorship, and the spiritual awakening that can accompany the use of these substances. We delve into the historical context of psychedelics, the importance of reclaiming ancient practices, and the future prospects for legalization and acceptance in society. We also reflect on the need for a balanced approach to psychedelics, advocating for microdosing as a means to navigate the current challenges while seeding a deeper understanding of the spiritual potential of these substances. And before we dive into all of that good stuff, if you are struggling with the challenges of walking your soul path in this crazy modern world and would benefit from guidance, support, and kinship, come join us at our Academy of the Soul, Unio. You can find out more at bemythical.com/Unio or click the link in the description. And now, going back to this week's episode, let's dive in. Hello, Paul. A huge, warm welcome back to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me back on the show. I'm excited to dive back in with you.
Yes. Yeah, we ended up covering some rich, deep ground on the last show. And it felt like now's time to kind of journey into perhaps the sort of darker underbelly, in that we were talking about how, and as often is the case, as there's this kind of, I often see it as like a soul deep calling, this like sort of instinctual move that so many people are feeling towards working with teacher plant psychedelics, and at the same time, there is this increasing sense of restrictions and limitations, legality, censoring, which I know that you've personally experienced an example of this week. And I was sharing with you, one of my friends is also going through something similar. And so it feels like something really helpful, again, talking to our listeners, many of whom are one way or another, coaches, healers, change workers who may already be working with psychedelics in their work or drawn to. There is this very real question of, oh gosh, how do I actually do this, knowing there's this kind of like all these things I'm going to face? Not least, I was saying to you in the sharing of our last episode, we were realizing just even getting people to see it in the face of kind of like, you never really know for sure, but you can tell by the numbers, like this has been in one way or another kind of, I don't want to use necessarily like it's been shadow banned, but it didn't get out to as many people as we expected. So that's what we're going to talk about. Where should we start? What's been your own journey with all of this, and perhaps start there?
Yeah. So when I started Third Wave back in 2015, I remember I started it under a pseudonym initially because I was slightly scared and hesitant to be fully out there in terms of my real name. And then when I actually sat with it, I was like, look, at the end of the day, if there is some sort of governmental agency that wants to come after me, whether or not I publish under a pseudonym is irrelevant.
What was the pseudonym? I missed that.
I think it was like Tom Williams or something really kind of lame, a bit more like that. Yeah, it was sort of off the cuff. Just something quick. And I actually, I published my first book on microdosing in 2016 and published it under that pseudonym. And then about a year in, I was just like, I don't think this is worthwhile. So I shifted off of that. And I would say over the last, 8-9 years, all things considered, there's been not a lot of censorship or prohibition. I mean, the recent banning, so kind of what happened is I posted a video on Instagram about psilocybin being the safest drug that is
Mm.
available. So it's safer than alcohol, safer than tobacco, safer than cannabis, safer than benzodiazepines, buprenorphine, other drugs as well. And this is based on scientific research that was published in 2010. And so I assumed, I'm providing education, I'm providing information that's based in scientific research. And we've done that through our platform for 8 years, 7 years, 8 years on Instagram now, and not had a single issue. And then all of a sudden it was like, you're banned. And then I appealed, and they're like, now you're permanently banned.
Oh my
And so
goodness! Because you had appealed,
well,
or you would
I
have been
think I
anyway.
appealed. They had a real person look at it, and they're like, "No, you're still banned." And the fact is, even in their own rules, they talk about how you can only get banned if you're attempting to sell illegal drugs through the platform. And obviously, we're educational; we don't sell any illegal drugs. So the whole getting banned was totally illogical and not by the rules. But the algorithm take us, and then probably the person in the back end has no context about what psychedelics actually are. And so they're just sort of following the rules. It's probably someone in India.
Yeah.
So I think, and what's interesting is, as you mentioned, your friend is starting to be more mindful about what's being talked about in psilocybin groups. I've heard more and more platforms getting banned. So there's clearly something happening where Meta is in the pocket of the federal government, right? We know this from what had happened with the Hunter Biden laptop story, with what had happened in the 2020 election, and they will censor things that the government asks them to. And my hypothesis is that in light of the recent FDA decision to reject MDMA for PTSD, and also in light of Matthew Perry's death with ketamine, where the DEA has publicly acknowledged that ketamine could be the next opioid crisis, I do think there's going to start to be a tightening of restrictions and censorship around psychedelics. And with all that said, like, I've been, we've tried to do paid advertising before, and we can't really do that because of the restrictions of Google and Meta and these other big tech platforms. We've definitely been tagged by YouTube before and been flagged, never been banned because we adjusted. So we've had these issues before with companies that are either owned by Google or Meta. And I think the opportunity that I look at is Twitter is sort of this bastion of free speech. And they've been very clear that there's more allowance for things on that platform. And so I think the message that I'm taking home is, rather than building on Meta or Instagram, it may be much wiser to build on social platforms, starting with Twitter, but I don't think Twitter will be the only one, but social platforms or messaging platforms that are not censoring material around this. Now, the tricky part is, we all probably saw the news about the Telegram CEO being arrested. Telegram has now announced that they will comply with federal government agencies specific to things that are illegal. And so the issue still comes back to the forefront that psychedelics are largely illegal, that the federal government refuses to deschedule them, even though the scheduling is totally unscientific, and that it'll still be probably 8 to 10 to 12 to 15 years before these are more widely legal and accepted. So all that to say, anyone who wants to get into this space, anyone who wants to support people, just know what you're going up against. But I think so many of us feel so called to this work because of how we personally have been transformed by it and how efficacious we notice it is, that we do it in spite of all of these challenges. And that still will be required if we are to actually move this process forward and generate, broad legalization and acceptance.
So we were talking before we started recordings, and I was saying that as with anything, this is happening on different levels and also sort of different timelines, in terms of there is a kind of there's a fear at the heart of this that's kind of manifesting in the laws, in the censoring, that's beyond the manifestations. This is kind of like a deeper thing that's in the collective, but also clearly showing up in individuals too. And then that's going to kind of like keep funny enough, a bit like mushrooms, keep popping up in these different ways. And as you're saying, if we do feel this deeper call to be to continue being what we see as a kind of I guess an expression of love in the face of that, these things are going to keep kind of like showing up in different ways. Like we can, for example, as you say, okay, we'll move off meta platforms and move to these ones, and yet it will then show up in a different way, whilst this is the energies that are playing out. And I think there's something in just recognizing that's the case. Like this goes beyond, countries, laws, people. Like this is just the kind of the energies that are at play at the moment. And so I'd love your sense as to kind of like what is going on there. Like what are the deepest level? What are these particular sort of archetypes that are playing out, and why now? Why in this way? Do you have a sense of that?
So a lot of the spiritual teachers I talk to come back to this point that we're sort of in this age of something spiritually important is happening. And sort of the best parallel is when the Roman Empire fell, we sort of, I would say, descended into these dark ages, at least in the West. Right. And for about 900 years, from the 6th century until the 15th century, we were in these dark ages until the printing press sort of brought us out of it. And we had the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and industrialization and blah, 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 blah. And I think we're at a similar time period now, but instead of it being about the literacy to read and write, it's really the sort of spiritual literacy of how to navigate a world that is becoming increasingly complex and uncertain, and especially a world in which sovereignty is essential to maintain in the face of big tech, artificial intelligence, world governments, et cetera, et cetera. So we're sort of hitting this bifurcation point where there will be people who choose to continue to stay in this sort of matrixy AI, pharmaceutical, big agricultural world of sickness, disease, suffering, depression. And I think there are a lot of other people, particularly those who are waking up through psychedelics, meditation, breath work, who will choose a form of life and existence that is much more around holistic wellness, intentional sovereignty, real freedom of choice, localized community, and there will be both of that. And so I do think those who choose the path of true freedom and sovereignty will be in the minority, but I am hopeful that there will still be the spaciousness for that to happen. And I think if we look at it with a more particular lens to psychedelics, anytime psychedelics have become quite prominent, there's always been this sort of backlash. There's always been this pushback. There's always been these forces that want to keep the, I would say, evolution of consciousness, or even the capacity to democratize awakening, keep it sort of under wraps. And the mythical story of this is Prometheus. And Prometheus was a god who stole fire and brought it to the mortals, and for that was punished by Zeus, where he was essentially left out on a cliffside to forever be tormented by the fates that would come and eat his liver every single day, right? And so I think archetypally, any person or individual or group that has attempted to bring fire, and in this case fire is awakening or higher consciousness, to a broader demographic, has been crucified, for lack of a better term.
Tortured.
Exactly. So now we see exceptions to that, right? And I think the 20th century is a great model of how that's actually shifted. So we see, I mean, the lineage there is Thoreau to Tolstoy to Gandhi to MLK to Nelson Mandela. And so I'm optimistic that although there will continue to be pushback, just like there was for Mandela in South Africa, just like there was for MLK in the United States, just like there was for Gandhi in India, there will continue to be pushback. I do believe in sort of the force of good that eventually psychedelics will find their place in our sort of cultural sphere, just like segregation died or integration came about or colonization, left India so they could finally be a sovereign people. So I am actually still optimistic in spite of some of the archetypal stuff. But I think a lot of people were just counting on MDMA will get approved by the FDA. Like the sort of wins are just going to continue to stack up. There's not going to be any resistance. And I think the recognition now over the last month or two of this may be a little bit more of an uphill battle than we originally thought is starting to sink in for a lot of folks.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there. There's a couple of things that stood out to me as you were talking. So I'm going to name both of them and then you feel free to pick either of them as the strand will then start to pull on. So one was the way that in the psyche, psychedelics often work in terms of creating entropy. So they are kind of breaking up those known systems. They're creating this kind of, seeming chaos. So things can be kind of then brought back together anew. And I was really seeing, as you were talking, there was a kind of like, I had this sort of visual image of like, of course, that is what's happening collectively as well. Like in our culture, there is this kind of entropy being created, but of course it's running up against forces that want to keep the structure. And so it's kind of like, as ever, within, without, below, above, it's all happening at each level at once. And so I had a really sort of strong visual of course, that's how it's working in both places. The other thing that really stood out to me is, of course, the title of this show is Be Mythical. And, as soon as someone starts talking about myths and archetypes, they're speaking my language. And so I was thinking, what's interesting to me is in one telling of the myth of Chiron, the wounded healer, the centaur, he actually, I guess, saves Prometheus in that he, in an act of wanting to kind of escape his own pain of this kind of unhealable wound. So we've got this Chiron, this incredibly wise, compassionate healer who is, really adept, really knowledgeable, really wise, and yet has this unhealable wound. He offers to swap places with Prometheus in a kind of like act of grace. But as it turns out, they're kind of both taken pity on. So Chiron is made immortal and Prometheus is freed. And it really stood out to me that the wounded healer is an archetype that's like very, he's like in my awareness a lot in the work that I do. And I was thinking this month in particular in our Academy of Soul Unio, we've been working with the wounded healer a lot. So he's been very present for me. So you bringing that, which is kind of part of his myth, I was like, there's no coincidence here. There's some synchronicity. So again, what of what I've just shared is kind of like glinting to you to pull a strand.
Well, I don't know the myth of Chiron that well, so I'm not super familiar with the wounded healer. Like I'm familiar with that archetype. I'm familiar of what it represents, and I'm also well aware that a lot of therapists and medical doctors, and especially those who are working with psychedelics, they come from that place, right? And psychedelics often help them to heal these wounds when other things haven't helped them, which is why they feel so compelled then to be in service to what the medicine can do for others, right? So there is like a distinct relationship there. And I think the entropy point is really interesting, right? That when we take, especially a high dose of a psychedelic in particular, it introduces a lot of entropy, which is actually where a lot of the benefit comes from. Because a lot of these things around depression or PTSD or addiction or anxiety are about a sort of tightening or constriction of the neural networks that we have. And so psychedelics kind of open those up again. So these old neurons that have died off can reform and recreate and be catalyzed to be active once again. But when that happens too quick or too much, it ends up leading to instability. And we saw this in the 50s and 60s in the second wave of psychedelics, that LSD wasn't necessarily the problem per se. It was just that we had way too many people doing way too much of it. And so that's why publicly I focused on microdosing so much, because microdosing does introduce a little bit of entropy, but it's more of like a hormetic stressor rather than a sort of chaos agent, if you will, like high doses of psychedelics.
Yeah.
And so with just that little bit of interruption done consistently over a period of time, there's an easier way to integrate it both individually and collectively. And so I think, how we manage that entropy, and even, I do believe in this sort of divine intelligence and divine timing. And a lot of people, including myself, were very disappointed with the FDA's rejection of MDMA therapy. And in reflection on that, I don't think it's too far off to say that it may be for the best in the long term, because over the last 6 years, since Michael Pollan published How to Change Your Mind, we've seen this, meteoric growth of interest in psychedelics. And what that has meant is you have millions of people who are starting to utilize these. You have a lot of coaches and practitioners who are offering support with this, but a lot of these people are still quite noobish in terms of how they approach it. And so even, I just read a stat that like in 2024, searches for psychedelics dropped by 40%. And so we're even seeing this sort of tail off, which I think in the long term is probably beneficial, because this hype cycle has sort of run its course. There's a capacity to be more objective with both the pros and the cons, and then truly approach sort of continuing to build out a foundation for this to be successful in the long term.
Yes. Yeah. I love what you've just said there, where there is a place personally for microdosing, but then perhaps the same is true collectively. It's like perhaps, sometimes the macrodose is needed, but sometimes there is a time and a place for microdosing, and perhaps this is that time.
Right.
But again, I mean both personally, but also the way this is seeped into the collective. Perhaps there does need to be a kind of a softening and a kind of, sometimes limits are needed. We don't often welcome them, and yet they are something that's kind of part of that whole, as you say, the divine intelligence weaving through all of this. Something popped into my mind that seems unrelated, and yeah, I'm going to trust there's a reason it popped into my mind. I think it's partly to do with what you were saying, in that kind of like this rush where you have a lot of people that are very new to this, that, full of passion, and often, well-intentioned, and yet there is a kind of, there's all of the issues that come within experience. The thing I'm about to say doesn't appear to relate to that, but I'm going to just tell you what it is anyway, because I think you'll hear something in it, is my hope. So in the shamanic communities I'm part of, there's been, I'm not going to go into the sort of details and name names, because it's not really relevant. It is again kind of more archetypal really, but there's been a big kind of, I guess you could say, scandal, controversy, where one of the most long-standing teachers and training centres of shamanism here in Britain, his work was meant to have been founded on this kind of ancient lineage of bee shamanism, and it's now been shown to have been a fabrication, is the allegation. It's all kind of, is it become a big legal thing? But of course it's, lots and lots of people have either trained with them, friends with them, it's a whole thing. And that's really just kind of been breaking, and kind of, again, lots of people in my community talking about it just this week. And for some reason, as you're talking, and it may have been partly, I've just realized there's a kind of, often is the case, there's a symbolic thing. You mentioning Michael Pollan, this thing was called the Path of the Pollen. So it may have been something like that. But equally, it does feel like there's something in that. There's almost like a cautionary tale that felt like it belongs in this conversation in some way. Have you got any sense of kind of like what might be there energetically as a lesson or a guide for us in this?
Well, I think the false lineage in psychedelics is the psychotherapeutic approach to working with them. So my argument would be, the parallel in the psychedelic space is that psychedelics historically for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, were used by shamans who were the doctors of indigenous societies and communities to help heal sort of spiritual sickness. And they were most commonly used in rites of passage or in mysteries in ancient Greece and ancient India in larger collective groups as a way to experience the oneness and divinity of existence. And in the 20th century, we did a phenomenal job of pathologizing the maladaptation to a sick culture. So the DSM, depression, addiction, anxiety, and we've reintroduced psychedelics in the modern lexicon to address these mental health or clinical issues, when in fact, mental health and clinical issues, I would argue, are a fabrication of modernity that actually don't have any lineage or historical backing to them. And so my argument would be the rejection of MDMA by the FDA is a representation of this and a signifier of this, that I am highly skeptical of psychedelics ever actually being brought into the sort of federal medical apparatus, because it is a paradigm of treatment or approach to the psyche and the person that is actually completely opposite from what psychiatric medications represent. And so I think that is the sort of larger edifice that is starting to fall away in the psychedelic space. And it's why I would argue it's so critical that we have to do a better job of amplifying the true Western lineage of psychedelics, which were these mystery schools. The Eleusinian mysteries was the most prominent one, but there were many, many other mystery schools that also utilize psychedelics. And we have to bring it back into this sort of community group element rather than staying so focused on the sort of pathology clinical approach with these powerful medicines.
You've just touched into something that is so profound, and it's like it's funny because, how can I put this? Because my own path and work is coming so much from the place that you were kind of saying we need to get back to, is in the whole reason I even kind of am called to all the work I do is spiritual in nature, is kind of it hasn't come via that kind of more mainstream pathologizing route. And so I forget sometimes that that is the way that it has started to go. And as you were talking, then I was like, of course, this is so much deeper than the kind of like, again, these surface manifestations where there's been this a kind of land grab by sort of various like different types of ways of working and different worldviews. But you're right, fundamentally, this was never how we worked with things, because the kinds of things that we're now pathologizing just weren't really present in the way that they are today. And if they are used as a kind of sticking plaster over these issues that are created by the way that we're living, we're not actually addressing the kind of like how we're living that's causing those manifestations. Correct. But also missing the deeper spiritual reality that's underneath all of that. There's something so important in that.
Well, and this is what Nietzsche predicted when he said God is dead and we have killed him, that our emphasis on the seen over the unseen, that our emphasis on science and materialism over, I would say, spirituality and the mysteries, that has led us in the 20th century to this nihilistic perspective and attitude that we are just machines.
Yeah.
And I think what so many people discover after they go through psychedelic experiences or any sort of meditative or enlightening or mystical experiences, they come to recognize that we are not machines, in fact, that we are something much more complex. We are something much more unique. We are something much more alive than machines. And that the whole DSM and this sort of notion of depression and addiction and anxiety comes out of this ethos of being a machine. And if you just take a pill, it'll fix it. Because that pill, their hypothesis was, for example, with SSRIs, is, depression is tied to an imbalance with serotonin. You fix this drug, it's going to fix the imbalance and it's going to fix you. And what we know now is that's not the case whatsoever. Right. So we're really having to reevaluate what it means to live well. And for me, when I, even first started taking psychedelics 15 years ago, that the download that I got was the more that we live in alignment, or the more that I live in alignment with how my ancestors lived for thousands of years before me, the healthier I will be, the healthier I will become. And Nassim Taleb, who's this brilliant thinker, he's written books like Anti-Fragile and the Black Swan trilogy. He talks about this concept called the Lindy effect. And the idea of the Lindy effect is that the longer an idea or technology has been around, the more useful it is to our survival and thriving as a human species. So in other words, longevity is an indicator of utility. And so whenever we talk about Prozac, whenever we talk about, psychotherapy, whenever we talk about these things that have only been around for 50 years as if it's going to address the root cause of what we're struggling with, we're missing the point totally and completely, that we actually have to retrieve a lot of these ancient practices and figure out how do we weave them into a new structure that can both recognize the value of spirituality and also the, I would say, value of science, right? Because this isn't throwing the baby out with the bathwater. This is saying, what are the negative aspects of industrialization that we still attach to or hold on to? And how do we let those go, but still maintain a lot of the knowledge base and approach to, I would say, information gathering that the scientific method has taught us? And obviously, there's a lot there. I could continue to go on, but I do think that's sort of the moment and of the time, especially in the conversation around artificial intelligence and AI, that AI is just an extension of this concept of that we as humans are machines. And so we're going to build a better machine that's better than us, when in fact, it's more likely to be like a Frankenstein. And I'm somewhat surprised that these individuals who are building AI companies are not wise enough to read literature from, Mary Shelley and when she wrote Frankenstein.
Yes. There's so much here. It's like we're kind of moving into a whole other episode territory. So
Right, yeah.
recognizing we don't have huge amounts of time left, I'm wondering kind of like where can we go without finding ourselves too far down the road at this point. So firstly, you very much are preaching to the converted. It's so interesting how our soul kind of takes us through these like different evolutions. Just talking personally, I kind of originally started with a much more of a kind of like ascension spirituality, then kind of went into sort of more rewilding space, and then shamanism, and then kind of, and it's funny how, all of that one way or another has been that kind of reclamation of the things you're talking about. And I love that idea of sort of longevity and efficiency. I think you said efficiency, where it's my sense is that's kind of, there's two strands to that. There's part of it which is in order for something to last, it has to be effective, because otherwise we wouldn't have continued using it, particularly in times where, it was about survival. It wasn't just about a kind of nice to have. It was really about survival. But there's also the fact that the longer something is around, the more we've kind of evolved in relationship to it.
Right.
And so the two things become so interwoven. You could say, and depending on what we're talking about, in this case, we're talking about psychedelics. It seems to me that they've kind of grown along with humans in a way. They're so entwined with us, and depends what level you want to talk about, with our souls, with our bodies, with our ways of life, with what keeps us healthy, what keeps us connected. It feels to me that it's so already intrinsically woven in our DNA, that this is actually a reclamation of something that's already there, but it's a reclamation of knowing it.
And the modern challenge is, going back to what we talked about at the beginning of the episode, is then the fact that we have had this long lineage in history, right? Our evolution has been intimately intertwined with the use of plant medicines and, these psychoactive agents. And really, for the first time in the history of humanity, these are banned on a global scale.
Yes.
And so that's sort of like the kicker, right? That because now that we live in a globalized society, where specifically the United States has had hegemonies in the post-World War II era, and they have required all other states as part of the United Nations to adopt the same legal policy, we now live under sort of the shadow of the Death Star in many ways. And so I think when we talk about big tech censorship, when we talk about the FDA, when we talk about even the military industrial complex, all of these are antithetical to the core lessons and teachings of what plant medicines bring about. So we do need to reclaim these spiritual practices. We do need to reclaim psychedelics as tools. And it's easier now than it's ever been. And that's in large part because of LSD in the 60s. To come back to that, Ken Kesey, who most of your listeners have heard of, wrote a book called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, in which he wrote a story specifically about a lot of the things that we're talking about today. The sort of nastiness of a psychiatric hospital, and how we treat madness, and how we treat thinking differently, and how we treat all these sorts of things. And the very fact that he was able to bring LSD into Palo Alto actually led to the invention of the computer and the internet and all these other things that are now these decentralizing technologies, right? So we're living in a time that is ripe for the shifts and the changes. And we now have the technology available to us. And I think it is a matter of patience, a matter of, let's say, civil disobedience, and a matter of go small before we go big. In other words, microdosing is a really great sort of onboarding ramp for most folks who want to engage in this.
I don't think we've done a great job of kind of coming to a gentle halt. I do feel like we could, there's Continue. So much more that we could say about this, but yeah, and in some ways it's kind of like we're talking about this right now, and these things are all kind of happening right now. We could talk again in a year, and I think all of this would have kind of moved on a bit. So there is also that recognition that we're here right at the kind of as this wave is happening, or these sort of waves are crashing together. So before we go, what's your sense as to kind of what does the landscape look like in the next year, 5 years, when it comes to the things we're talking about?
Yeah, I think in the next year, you'll see Massachusetts legalize psychedelics in a very similar way that Colorado has legalized psychedelics. I think you'll see at least one or two more ballot initiatives that are brought about, maybe in California or New York. I think there will also be one or two state legislatures in the United States who look to pass bills specific to making psychedelics more accessible. We may even see the federal government of Canada look to legalize, certain forms of psychedelics like they did with cannabis. And I think equally so, you'll see anyone who is in the pocket of the FDA, including or big government like the US federal government, which would be Meta, Instagram, big pharmaceutical companies, the DEA, they will continue to tighten their restrictions around psychedelics in particular. So I do think you'll see this continued contraction. I don't think it's going to get easier. I think it's going to get harder for a lot of people in the psychedelic space. I don't think we will be the only Instagram that gets banned. I would anticipate that in the next 1 to 2 months, a lot of the other major platforms will also be banned. And then in the next 5 years, I think you'll see, like we saw in cannabis, my anticipation would be California has legalized psychedelics, New York has legalized psychedelics, Illinois, Michigan have legalized psychedelics, Washington. You'll probably see 8 to 10 states that have legalized psychedelics within the next 5 years, as well as I'm hopeful that the FDA will approve some sort of psychedelic medicine. So as you can imagine, I'm bullish on the long-term sort of prospects for psychedelics. I do believe that these will get woven into our cultural sphere. I believe the cat is out of the bag, that we've opened Pandora's box, so to say. And I do think it is up to us now to figure out how to responsibly steward this and ensure that as people generate more or get more access to these, that they start low and go slow. So I do think microdosing is essential. I think it is critical to navigating this on a collective level and basis. And it's even why, there's Third Wave. I have our training program for coaches and practitioners, but I've also started a nonprofit called the Microdosing Collective, where the focus of that nonprofit is how do we create legal regulatory policy for microdoses of psilocybin mushrooms. So, the work is not easy. I definitely get paid way less than I thought I would, having been kind of, navigating this for 9 or 10 years now. But for me, this is really a mission of the heart. And I'm, in spite of all of the obstacles and the challenges that have come up, I'm still very enthusiastic about the sort of long-term chances of what's going to unfold in the psychedelic space.
Well, that was a more hopeful message than I was anticipating, you might say.
Gotta. I don't have a choice, right?
Exactly. This is just the darker moment on the hero's journey.
Well, it's good to explore both sides, and it's good to bring awareness to the dark, and it's good to have that. But I'm not necessarily a cynical person, nor am I a fatalist. So I do believe there's still choice and agency and sovereignty, and I will continue to beat that drum as long as I'm alive, and maybe we will enter a true dark ages and they'll go after all these people and, I'll be in prison in 3 years, but the likelihood of that, I would say, is it's not zero, but it's not substantial either.
Well, bless you. Thank you so much for doing what you do. I can feel your heart is in it completely. So, where can listeners find out about you? And clearly not Instagram at the moment.
Not on Instagram at the moment. I'm very active on Twitter. And my personal Instagram, I'm very active on it. I've had no problems, knock knock, yet with my personal Instagram. So that's Paul Austin 3W. I post a lot of reels there and educational information. We have our own podcast, the Psychedelic Podcast. So if folks want to go deeper into this, that's a great resource to check out. And then the thirdwave.co, right? That's our educational hub. We have information on our training program for coaches and practitioners. We have a microdosing experience that I group coach. So folks should just go there, check out Third Wave, sign up for our newsletter, and then get in touch with me with any questions or things that you're kind of curious about or wondering about from this conversation today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Paul. This has been a real pleasure. We've ended up going to places I was not anticipating yet again. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I very much hope you enjoyed watching that. And if you did and you're not already subscribed, then do hit that bell thingy and subscribe to automatically get each fresh new episode as it's released each week. If you'd like to find out more about the work we do at Be Mythical to guide and support old souls in this new world to live their own unique myth, do hop along to bemythical.com and you'll find out all the ways you can join us and go deeper with us on your own mythical journey. Lots of love for now. Mwah. See you again next week.